So this video is going to look at amnesia. Now there's two types of amnesia that you need to understand. The first is anterograde amnesia. Now anterograde amnesia is the inability to store any new long-term memories after a brain injury. So you might still be able to access information or previous memories from your past life and what you remember. You might know who you are, where you live, who your husband is. But the problem is that you're not going to be able to encode or store any new memories from the moment of that brain damage. So I showed you the example here of things like 51st dates, people who are unable to make new memories. So for example, we looked at a BBC documentary of a lady that suffered with anterograde amnesia, and after 10 years since the brain damage, in those 10 years she's got no recollection of anything that happened in those 10 years. Now, the reason for this is because the short-term memory is actually intact, so there's no damage there to the short-term memory. The damage is to the ability of transferring information from the short term into the long term memory to make sure we remember it. Now this is why these people often have a memory that doesn't last any longer than 30 seconds, because we know our short term memory will only last for 18 to 30 seconds. So it's this idea that after 30 seconds it's almost like you can click your finger and their mind goes blank, and then they start the next 30 seconds again without remembering what happened in the 30 second before. So symptoms of somebody suffering from anterograde amnesia might be as small as not remembering that they had breakfast that morning, not remembering that you were in the room 5 minutes ago, not remembering that they saw you last week. But they will remember that prior to the brain damage, 10 years ago, they got married in Paris, they studied at Kiel, they went to Ormiston Stanley Matthews. They've got lots of information like that, but they can't make new one. Now, just a quick link here, if you think about the multi-store model of memory, this would explain anterograde amnesia as the short-term box, and the long-term box, we know that we have to be able to rehearse information to get it from short-term into long-term, and this would explain this idea of this rehearsal loop being broken, and therefore we can't transfer information from short-term into long-term, so no new information is getting into long-term memory. And therefore, as a result, people remember information that is already in long-term memory, and people can people can remember information within short-term memory, but they just can't transfer between the two, and therefore no new memories can be encoded. Now, different to this is retrograde amnesia. Now, this is when a patient, again, has suffered from a brain injury, but they can't access any memories that were encoded or stored from prior, so before the brain injury. So, for example, in this case, they might wake up from a brain injury and not know who they are, not know where they are, not know how they got there, have absolutely no recollection of the brain injury itself or what they were doing or where they were, because they can't access the memories from before the injury. Now, with retrograde amnesia, they should be able to encode new memories after the brain damage, but they can't access or retrieve information from long-term memory from prior to the brain damage. Now, in a mild case, this might mean that you just forget maybe a year of your life or 2 years. But in quite a severe case, it might mean that you might not remember anything from before that accident. So you might not know who your family are, who you are, who your partner is, where you live, and it can be really, really quite daunting. Now, there are cases of retrograde amnesia in terms of people regaining that memory. So the brain damage is kind of being resolved and fixed and healing, and information is coming back. Often retrograde amnesia can be temporary due to brain trauma. For example, so if people have hit their head and forgotten certain things, but it does come back to them over time. But there are case studies out there where people have experienced this brain damage and that information and those memories never ever come back to them. So just to summarise, retrograde, remember the retro past, the 60s and the 70s. Retrograde amnesia is when we can't recall past events from prior to the brain injury. So we can't remember who we were beforehand. Whereas the anterograde amnesia is when we can't form new memories after the brain injury has taken place. An example exam question on the board for you to describe the difference between anterograde and retrograde amnesia. Mark scheme here if you've had a go at that and you want to have a little look. And another example here where it's a little bit more AO2. So Sophia isn't remembering getting married last month, but she does remember having a fiance. She does remember her childhood, where she went to university. Explain the memory loss that she's experiencing in terms of which type of amnesia. We know it's an AO2 question straight away because of Sophia. And again here, you get a mark for identifying the fact that it's got to be retrograde amnesia, so she can't recall the events before the brain damage. That's why she can remember her childhood and her fiance, because they might be from 10 years ago, for example, but she can't remember her wedding day, which might have only been a week ago. And there's one on the board if you want to have a practice that here as well as a separate, quite similar to Sophia question, but an exam question you can have a look at here, making sure that it includes the AO2.